Halfway to JFK, reality hit like a rogue wave. Frantic fingers dove into my carry-on, emerging with boarding passes and meticulously organized travel documents. All rendered useless, pathetic even, without the one thing that mattered. My passport. It was back on my nightstand. A silent sentinel guarding a secret I was only now beginning to understand. The previous evening, I'd held it, checked the expiration date one last, obsessive time. Now, that small act of responsibility felt like a cruel joke, a cosmic setup for the catastrophe unfolding. The London Conference. 6 months of relentless preparation, countless late nights fueled by lukewarm coffee and sheer determination. My chance to prove myself, to silence the whispers of doubt that still echoed in the halls of Thornfield Security Solutions. And now, potentially, all of it was slipping away. I wrestled the car around, taking the next exit with a screech of tires. Brooklyn Heights loomed ahead, each familiar brownstone now a mocking reminder of the life I thought I knew. My mind, ever the problem solver, was already calculating later flights, connecting cities, damage control. If I moved fast, maybe, just maybe, I could salvage something. I pulled up to our brownstone, a wave of irritation washing over me. The front door, a heavy oak affair that Jackson usually secured with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, stood ajar. Cardinal sin in Brooklyn. He never left doors unlocked. But my passport-induced panic was a thick fog, obscuring common sense. I was laser-focused on retrieval, on getting back on the road, on somehow clawing back the opportunity that was rapidly vanishing. Then I heard it, his voice, drifting down from the upper reaches of our home. But it wasn't the voice I knew. Not the gentle baritone that soothed my anxieties or the playful teasing that punctuated our weekends. This was something else. A low, intimate murmur that sent a shiver of unease crawling across my skin. He was talking to someone, discussing what? Property transfers? Foreclosure proceedings? The words, delivered with casual cruelty, hung in the air like poison. And then the dagger. How easy it had been to deceive me. My legal training, honed over years of boardroom battles and late-night negotiations, slammed into gear, overriding the instinct to scream, to confront, to shatter the fragile facade of normalcy. Gather information, assess the damage, control the narrative. That was always the key. I moved closer to the staircase, each step measured, silent. The next 60 seconds ripped the foundations from my life. My husband, the man I had pledged to spend my life with, was a stranger. Our marriage, a carefully constructed lie. And I, the trusting, ambitious fool, was standing in my own home, listening to him meticulously plan my destruction, convinced I was safely on my way to another continent. The 25-minute drive back through Brooklyn was a blur of red lights and jarring turns. My mind was a runaway train, replaying the morning, dissecting every moment, searching for the clues I had so blindly missed. Jackson had been up before me, as was his habit on travel days. I'd found him in the kitchen, a domestic tableau of perfect husbandliness. French toast, dusted with cinnamon, my favorite. My travel mug, already filled with the strong, dark coffee I needed to face the day. He'd kissed me, his hand resting on the small of my back, a gesture that always felt comforting, reassuring. He told me he would miss me terribly, those blue eyes of his filled with what I now recognized as expertly feigned sincerity. I had believed him, every word. Why wouldn't I? 7 years of marriage had built a fortress of trust, a seemingly impenetrable shield against doubt. Or so I thought. The London Conference. It represented everything I had poured myself into since taking over my father's company. Thornfield Security Solutions. The name felt heavy now, laden with irony. As Chief Risk Officer, I was scheduled to deliver a keynote address about the looming threats in artificial intelligence security. The invitation from the European Cybersecurity Alliance had been a validation, a signal that I was finally being recognized as a leader in my field. 6 months. I had poured 6 months into crafting the perfect presentation, refining my arguments, anticipating the challenges from a room full of international experts. This was my moment, my chance to prove that I belonged, that a woman could not only survive but thrive in a field still dominated by men who often questioned my credentials before they even considered my ideas. My father had built Thornfield from the ground up, a scrappy little cybersecurity consulting firm operating out of a converted warehouse in Red Hook. 2 employees, a handful of local clients, and a relentless dedication to protecting the vulnerable from the ever-evolving threats of the digital world. When he died suddenly, unexpectedly, from a heart attack, I was 28 years old, armed with a law degree and precisely 0 experience running a tech company. The vultures circled almost immediately. Offers to buy poured in within days of the funeral. Competitors smelling blood, assuming I would be too overwhelmed by grief and inexperience to do anything but sell. They underestimated me. Instead of succumbing, I had transformed his modest practice into a firm that now protected Fortune 500 companies from sophisticated digital threats. 40 employees, offices in 3 cities, and annual revenue that would have made him burst with pride. Jackson had been there seemingly every step of the way. We had met at a legal conference in Manhattan just 6 months after my father's death. I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of grief and the sudden responsibility of running a company I barely understood. He approached me after my presentation on data protection regulations, genuinely interested in my work, asking insightful questions that showed he had actually been listening. He was handsome, but in an understated way. Dark hair, just beginning to silver at the temples. Blue eyes that seemed to see past the professional armor I had learned to wear, to the raw vulnerability beneath. Our courtship was a slow burn, a comforting balm to my wounded soul. Long conversations over candlelit dinners, sharing our dreams and fears. He would cook while I worked late, bringing me wine and offering quiet encouragement without making me feel guilty for the hours I devoted to building the company. He never complained about my schedule, never demanded I choose between him and my career. Instead, he supported me, encouraged me, became the person I trusted most in the world. The proposal came during a weekend trip to the Finger Lakes, standing on a dock at sunset as the water shimmered gold around us. I said yes without a single hesitation. The wedding was small, intimate. Family and close friends gathered in my mother's garden in Cobble Hill. Jackson cried when he saw me walking down the makeshift aisle between rows of white chairs. I remember thinking my heart would burst from happiness. My mother had embraced him afterward, whispering that my father would have loved him, that she was grateful I had found someone who would take care of me the way he always had. Jackson had been particularly wonderful with my mother after we married. She lived alone in the Cobble Hill brownstone where I had grown up, the same house where my father had carried her over the threshold as a young bride in 1985. The building was more than just a home. It was 3 generations of family history, memories etched into every brick, every beam. My father's presence still lingered in the garden he had cultivated and the bookshelves he had built with his own hands. After his death, my mother struggled. The grief was a heavy cloak, suffocating her spirit, and the practical aspects of managing the property proved overwhelming. Rental units on the ground floor required constant maintenance. Tenant issues needed handling, repairs could not wait, and property taxes seemed to increase exponentially as the neighborhood gentrified around her. I watched her confidence erode, her spirit dim as she tried to navigate a world my father had always managed for her. Jackson had stepped in, a knight in shining armor. He volunteered to help, spending weekends fixing leaking faucets and reviewing financial documents that made her eyes glaze over with confusion. I was so grateful, so relieved, to have someone willing to take on that burden, to care for my mother as if she were his own family. He was patient with her in ways I sometimes struggled to be, never making her feel foolish for not understanding things that seemed obvious to him. When he suggested consolidating some of the family financial accounts to make management easier, it seemed like a thoughtful solution from someone who genuinely wanted to ease our burdens. My mother signed the power of attorney documents he prepared, trusting him completely, and I, blinded by love and gratitude, countersigned them without reading the fine print. Too busy with a major client presentation to scrutinize paperwork from my own husband. We were handing him the keys to everything my parents had built, and neither of us had any idea what we were doing. Now, standing in the foyer of our brownstone, my hand gripping the banister, listening to Jackson's voice drift down from his third-floor office. Everything shattered. The tone. It was completely foreign, devoid of the affection, the warmth, the playfulness I had come to expect. There was satisfaction in it, a chilling pleasure as he discussed property transfers and foreclosure proceedings with someone he called sweetheart. Sweetheart. The word constricted my chest. He had never called me sweetheart. He used my name, sometimes adding terms of endearment like honey or babe, but sweetheart belonged to someone else. I forced myself to remain still, to listen. My legal training, that cold, calculating voice of reason, kicked in again, overriding the emotional tsunami threatening to engulf me. Gather evidence. Build a case. Never act impulsively. Jackson was saying something about how I had just left for the airport, how the stupid woman had believed the London story. The words were a physical assault, each one landing with brutal precision. He talked about documents being ready, about my mother's house being in foreclosure by Tuesday, about how I had signed everything myself and actually thanked him for helping manage the family finances. My grip on the banister tightened, my knuckles turning white. My mother's house, the brownstone in Cobble Hill, the repository of every memory of my childhood, every piece of my father that remained. Jackson was discussing it as if it were just another asset, another line item on a balance sheet, ripe for liquidation. Then he said the words that irrevocably altered the landscape of my life. After all these years of pretending to love that frigid, controlling woman, I am finally going to get what I deserve. What we both deserve, sweetheart. Pretending. 7 years of marriage reduced to a performance. 7 years of my love, met with contempt I had been too blind, too trusting to see. I stood in that foyer and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Something that felt like a death and a rebirth occurring simultaneously. The woman who had walked out of this house 40 minutes ago, the trusting, loving, perhaps even naive woman who believed in the inherent goodness of her husband, no longer existed. The woman standing here now was someone else entirely. Someone colder, harder, whose mind was already dissecting the situation with the same analytical precision she applied to cybersecurity threats. Jackson believed I was gone. He thought he had 5 days to finalize his scheme, 5 days to bleed me dry while I remained blissfully ignorant across an ocean. He had no idea I was standing 20 feet below him, listening to every word. My legal mind was already cataloging evidence, constructing a strategy. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, not even from heartbreak. They were shaking from rage, a white-hot fury that coursed through my veins, from the sudden, terrifying understanding that I had been living inside an elaborate con for 7 years, and from the cold, unwavering determination to make Jackson pay for every single lie he had ever told me. I needed to hear more. Every instinct screamed at me to run up those stairs and confront him, to demand explanations, to unravel the tangled web of deceit. But my legal training held me in place. Evidence first, understanding second, action third. I moved closer to the staircase, each step deliberate, silent. The third step from the bottom always groaned under pressure. The landing halfway up had a loose board near the railing. 7 years of living in this house had taught me its language, and now that knowledge became my shield, my weapon. Jackson's voice continued to drift down, crystal clear. Our brownstone, built in 1920, possessed quirks of construction that defied logic. High ceilings and original woodwork carried sound in unexpected ways. A seemingly private conversation on the 3rd floor could be heard distinctly in the foyer if you knew where to stand. I positioned myself at the base of the stairs, where the acoustics were sharpest, and forced my breathing to slow to quiet. No, don't worry, he was saying, his tone reassuring, almost gentle. A tone I recognized, a tone I had once found so comforting. Now it made my stomach churn. By the time she gets back in 5 days, everything will be locked down. The property transfer documents are ready. Her mother's brownstone will be in foreclosure by Tuesday. The old woman doesn't even check her accounts anymore. My mother's brownstone. The words detonated in my chest. That house was worth nearly $2 million in the current market, but its value transcended money. 3 generations of my family had lived there. My grandmother had died in the upstairs bedroom. My father had proposed to my mother in the garden. I had taken my first steps on the hardwood floors of the living room. Every brick held a memory. Every room contained echoes of people we had loved and lost. And Jackson was discussing it as casually as if it were just another property transaction. A soulless exchange of numbers on a spreadsheet. And the best part, he continued, and I could hear the smile in his voice, the smug satisfaction of a man who believed himself clever, untouchable. She signed everything herself. Every single document over the past year. She actually thanked me for helping manage the family properties while she was so busy with work. The memory flashed back with sickening clarity. 8 months ago, Jackson had presented me with a stack of papers at the kitchen table one evening. He had explained that consolidating the family accounts would make everything easier to manage, that my mother was getting confused by multiple statements from different banks, that streamlining the process would reduce stress for everyone. I had been preparing for a major client presentation at the time. My laptop open beside my dinner plate, my mind already halfway through the security protocols I needed to review. I had signed where he indicated without reading carefully, trusting him completely because he was my husband. Why would my husband hurt me? After all these years of pretending to love that frigid, controlling woman? Jackson said, his voice shifting again, becoming harder, colder. I'm finally going to get what I deserve, what we both deserve. Sweetheart, sweetheart. He was talking to someone else. Someone who was not his wife. Someone who was his partner in this elaborate scheme. His co-conspirator in the destruction of my life. The betrayal doubled in that instant, multiplying into something so vast, so monstrous, that I could barely comprehend its dimensions. This was not just theft. This was not just fraud. This was an intimate violation, perpetrated by someone I had shared a bed with. Someone I had entrusted with my body, my heart, and my family's legacy. I heard him laugh at something the other woman said. That genuine, unguarded sound of amusement I had always believed I inspired in him during quiet evenings at home. The laugh I had fallen in love with during our courtship. Except now I understood it had never been for me. Perhaps nothing had ever been for me. Perhaps I had been living with a stranger who wore my husband's face, who performed affection with practiced skill while feeling nothing but contempt. She'll land in London completely clueless. Jackson continued, his voice dripping with malicious glee. I've already scheduled the bank appointments for tomorrow morning. The foreclosure auction is set for Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday, we'll have control of the property and can flip it immediately. The market in Cobble Hill is insane right now. We're looking at a clean $700,000 profit after paying off the mortgage and the equity line. That was what my mother's home was worth to him. Not the memories, not the history, not the fact that an elderly woman who had already lost her husband would now lose the only place she had left that felt like home. Just numbers on a balance sheet. Just profit to be extracted and divided. I know, baby. I know, he said, his voice softening with an affection that made my chest physically ache. Just a few more days and we're done. We can finally stop pretending and get out of here. Maybe somewhere warm this time. You've been talking about Costa Rica. We could do that. Buy something on the beach. Live the life we've been planning for all these years. Costa Rica. The beach house. The life they had been planning. While I worked 60-hour weeks building a company, while I traveled for conferences and client meetings, while I trusted him to be the stable foundation of our marriage, he had been plotting an escape with another woman, planning to steal everything and disappear, leaving me with nothing but the wreckage of a life I thought was real. I should have felt devastated. I should have collapsed right there on the floor, crushed by the magnitude of the betrayal. Instead, something else was happening inside me, something cold and sharp and focused. The shock was transforming into clarity, the pain crystallizing into purpose. My mind began working through the implications with the same analytical precision I applied to cybersecurity threats at work. Jackson believed I was at the airport. He thought I was boarding a flight that would take me out of the country for 5 days. He had no idea I was standing in our home, listening to every word, learning the full scope of his plan. That ignorance was a weapon I could use. That temporary advantage was everything. I heard him moving around upstairs, his footsteps crossing the office floor. "I should go," he said to the woman on the phone. "I've got to meet with the attorney this afternoon to finalize the paperwork. I'll call you tonight after everything's signed. Love you, baby. Love you." He told her he loved her with the same casual ease most people used to say goodbye. How many times had he said those words to me while meaning absolutely nothing? How many moments of intimacy had been nothing but performance, calculation, strategic manipulation designed to keep me compliant, trusting? I heard the click of his phone disconnecting, then silence. He was probably reviewing documents, checking his timeline, making sure every piece of his plan was positioned correctly. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. No reason to believe his perfect scheme had just been exposed by something as mundane as a forgotten passport. I backed away from the stairs with the same careful precision I had used to approach them. The floorboard near the coat closet, the slight squeak in the hardwood by the door. I avoided them all, moving like a ghost through my own home until I reached the front door and eased it open just wide enough to slip through. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet street. I walked to my car with measured steps, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that brownstone. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I had to try twice before I could get the door unlocked. Once inside, I sat motionless for several long minutes, staring at our brownstone through the windshield, trying to reconcile the building I had loved with the crime scene it had just become. My phone sat in the cup holder where I had placed it during the drive back from the highway. I picked it up and stared at the screen, watching it blur as tears finally came. Not tears of sadness, not tears of grief, but tears of rage so intense they felt like they were burning my eyes. I had built a life with this man. I had trusted him with everything that mattered. I had believed in our future together with the kind of unwavering faith that now seemed impossibly naive. But crying would not help. Falling apart would not protect my mother, or save her home, or recover what had been stolen. I needed to think clearly, to move strategically, to become someone Jackson had never anticipated I could be. The woman who had driven away from this house 40 minutes ago would have confronted him immediately, demanded explanations, probably believed whatever lies he told her. That woman was gone. The woman sitting in this car now understood that she was at war. And the first rule of war was to never let your enemy know you were coming. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, forcing myself to drive at a normal speed, even though every instinct told me to floor the accelerator and put as much distance as possible between myself and that brownstone. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, but the physical pain helped ground me, kept me focused on what needed to happen next, rather than what I had just discovered. Jackson believed I was at the airport right now. He thought I was checking in for my flight, going through security, boarding a plane that would carry me across the Atlantic and leave him free to execute his plan without interference. That belief was the only advantage I had, and I needed to protect it at all costs. I could not go home. I could not contact him. I could not do anything that would alert him to the fact that his carefully constructed timeline had just been shattered by something as mundane as a forgotten passport. I drove through Brooklyn with no clear destination in mind at first, just moving, putting distance between myself and the life that had revealed itself to be a carefully staged performance. My phone sat in the cup holder, and I kept glancing at it, half expecting Jackson to call and somehow know that I had overheard everything. But the screen remained dark and silent. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. In his mind, I was already gone. After nearly 10 minutes of driving on autopilot, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a coffee shop in Park Slope, 3 neighborhoods away from Brooklyn Heights. It was a place I had never been before, somewhere Jackson would have no reason to look for me, even if he somehow discovered I had not boarded my flight. The coffee shop was quiet at this hour, with only a few customers scattered at tables, most of them absorbed in laptops or books. I chose a booth in the back corner where I could see the entrance but remain relatively hidden from casual observation. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. I needed help, but I needed to be strategic about who I contacted and what I revealed. The wrong move now could destroy everything. I took several deep breaths, forcing myself to think clearly despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Years of managing crisis situations at work had taught me that panic was the enemy of effective action. Assessment first, strategy second, implementation third. The first call went to Diana, my executive assistant. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying its usual professional efficiency. "Mia, you should be boarding soon. Is everything okay? I need you to do something for me," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "And I need you not to ask questions right now. Can you do that?" There was a brief pause, and I could almost hear her recalculating, recognizing the seriousness in my tone. Diana had worked for me for 6 years. She knew when something was genuinely wrong. "Of course. What do you need?" "Call the conference organizers in London. Tell them I've had a family emergency and cannot attend. Then I need you to cover for me at the office. If anyone asks where I am, tell them I'm at the conference as scheduled. Unreachable except by email." Another pause, longer this time. "Mia, what's going on? Are you safe?" That simple question nearly shattered the composure I had so carefully constructed. Diana was far more than just an employee. She was a lifeline I was desperately trying to cling to. Over the years, she'd become a confidant, a friend who instinctively knew when I was teetering on the edge of stress or drowning in my workload. She'd appear with a steaming cup of coffee during those endless afternoons, a small act of kindness that spoke volumes. She'd seamlessly cover for me when meetings bled over, a silent promise of support. The genuine concern etched in her voice threatened to unleash a torrent of tears I couldn't afford to shed. "I'm safe," I managed to choke out, willing my voice to remain steady. "I promise I'll explain everything soon, but right now, I need you to trust me implicitly and do exactly as I ask." "You're in London," Diana stated quietly, her tone a blend of understanding and readiness. "Got it, Mia. Whatever storm you're facing, I've got your back." I severed the connection before my composure completely shattered, my gaze fixed on the cold glass of my phone screen. One hurdle cleared. Now came the truly difficult part. Vanessa and I had navigated the treacherous waters of college life together as roommates. She'd been my anchor during the devastating aftermath of my father's death and those early, terrifying months of scrambling to run Thornfield when I felt utterly lost at sea. Post-graduation, she channeled her sharp intellect into becoming a forensic accountant, specializing in the intricate art of tracing hidden assets and exposing financial fraud for a roster of high-profile law firms and discreet private clients. We'd carved out time for monthly dinners, fiercely protecting our tradition, nurturing a bond that transcended distance and demanding careers. If anyone possessed the skills to unravel the twisted web Jackson had spun, to truly grasp the magnitude of his betrayal, it was Vanessa. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright. "Mia, I thought you were on a flight to London today. I need your help," I said, the tremor in my voice betraying my carefully constructed facade. "And I need absolute, unwavering confidentiality. Can you get to Brooklyn right now? What's wrong? You sound different." "Please, Vanessa, I can't begin to explain over the phone. Can you come? I'm in my office in Manhattan. I can be there in 30 minutes, tops. Where should I meet you?" I rattled off the address of a nondescript coffee shop, then ordered a coffee I had no intention of savoring, a mere prop to justify my claim on a quiet booth. The barista, a youthful face likely balancing college classes with her shifts, offered a smile, an automatic gesture of friendliness that felt jarringly disconnected from the nightmare consuming my reality. Clutching the cup, I retreated to the booth, my eyes tracing the delicate dance of steam as it spiraled and dissolved into the sterile, air-conditioned air. Vanessa arrived in a swift 28 minutes, her fiery red hair tamed into a severe bun, her initial concern morphing into outright alarm as her gaze locked onto my face. "Talk to me," she said, her voice firm. And so, I unburdened myself, recounting every stolen word I'd overheard, the chilling conversation detailing property transfers and looming foreclosures, the impending sale of my mother's beloved brownstone. I confessed to signing documents blindly, my trust misplaced, my comprehension tragically lacking. I described the woman Jackson called Sweetheart, his accomplice in whatever elaborate con he was orchestrating. By the time I finished, the initial shock had given way to the icy, professional focus I knew so well, the expression she reserved for dissecting complex financial records in high-stakes court battles. "We need to examine your accounts," she stated, already powering up her laptop. "All of them. Joint accounts, investment portfolios, property holdings, everything. And we need to do it now before he has any inkling that you suspect a thing." I can access most of it from my phone," I offered, my fingers still trembling slightly as I pulled up my banking app. What unfolded over the next 2 hours dwarfed the initial shock of Jackson's overheard conversation, rendering it almost insignificant in comparison. Vanessa navigated the digital labyrinth with methodical precision, guiding me through accessing accounts I'd barely glanced at in months, lulled into a false sense of security by my blind faith in my husband's financial competence. Trust. The word echoed in my mind, each repetition laced with increasingly bitter irony. The joint checking account appeared innocuous at first glance: regular deposits from my salary, predictable expenses for groceries, utilities, mortgage payments. But as Vanessa delved deeper into the transaction history, a sinister pattern emerged, one that sent a cold wave of nausea washing over me. Small, carefully masked transfers, typically ranging between $1,500 and $3,000, siphoned out of the account every few weeks for the past 18 months. The amounts were meticulously calculated to remain below the radar, avoiding the automatic fraud alerts triggered by larger sums. "Where is this money going?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as I watched Vanessa's fingers dance across the keyboard. "An account registered to something called Hearthstone Properties," she replied, her voice tight with barely suppressed anger. "Give me a few minutes. I need to make a few calls." She retreated outside to make her calls, speaking in the cryptic shorthand of financial forensics, leaving me alone in the booth to watch her through the window. Each call grew progressively longer, each conversation etching a deeper line of grim determination onto her face. When she finally returned, her demeanor confirmed my worst fears. "Mia," she began, her voice measured. "Jackson Rohr Brennan is not his real name. Or rather, Brennan isn't his original surname." She swiveled her laptop screen toward me, and I stared in disbelief at a digitized criminal record. Jackson Rohr, convicted of investment fraud in Connecticut 8 years prior, had served 2 years in a minimum security prison. Upon his release, he'd promptly filed for a legal name change, strategically adding Brennan to his surname to create a fabricated identity, one that wouldn't trigger background checks or raise suspicions among his intended victims. 8 years ago, 1 year before I'd met him at that legal conference in Manhattan. 1 year before he'd approached me after my presentation, feigning genuine interest in my work. It had all been meticulously orchestrated from the very beginning, a carefully constructed charade. "There's more," Vanessa said softly, pulling up a series of social media profiles. A woman named Sienna Hartley, 26 years old, blonde, and undeniably beautiful. Her Instagram feed was a curated display of luxury vacations and designer acquisitions. And there, partially obscured but unmistakable, lurking in the background of a beach photo, was Jackson. "She's his partner," Vanessa confirmed. "They're listed as co-owners of Hearthstone Properties. And Mia, they've done this before." My phone buzzed with a text message around midnight, the screen illuminating the darkness of my anonymous hotel room. "Missing you already. Hope the flight wasn't too rough. Call me when you land tomorrow morning." He'd even included a heart emoji at the end, a tiny digital symbol of affection that now felt like a cruel mockery. I resisted the urge to respond immediately. Instead, I meticulously calculated the time difference, considering when someone arriving in London after an overnight flight would reasonably be expected to call, and made a mental note to contact him at the appropriate hour. Every detail mattered now. Every action had to reinforce the carefully constructed lie that I was exactly where he believed me to be. Sleep remained elusive that night. I lay wide awake in the unfamiliar bed of the Lower Manhattan Hotel, where I checked in under Diana's name, my mind racing. My mother would be asleep in her brownstone in Cobble Hill, completely unaware that the home she'd cherished for 40 years was about to be snatched away. Jackson had scheduled the foreclosure auction for Tuesday. Today was Thursday. I had 5 days to stop him, but first, I needed to fully grasp the scope of his deception. Morning arrived with a somber gray light filtering through the hotel curtains. I showered and dressed mechanically, then drove to Cobble Hill before I could succumb to second guesses. My mother was an early riser, and I knew I'd find her awake even at 7 in the morning. The brownstone looked exactly as it always had, its brick facade bathed in the warm glow of the morning sun. The garden my father had lovingly cultivated still thriving despite his absence. I lingered in my car for several minutes, steeling myself for a conversation I desperately wanted to avoid. How do you tell your mother that the man she trusted, the man who'd fixed her leaky faucets and reviewed her bank statements and treated her with such apparent kindness, had been systematically robbing her blind? She answered the door in her bathrobe, her face registering surprise and genuine pleasure at the sight of me. Mia, sweetheart, what are you doing here? I thought you were flying to London yesterday. Change of plans, Mom. Can I come in? She stepped aside, instinctively moving toward the kitchen to prepare coffee, an ingrained habit of hospitality. I followed her through rooms filled with furniture that held the echoes of 3 generations of family life, past photographs on the walls capturing my father's face frozen in moments of joy, to the sun-drenched kitchen. Is everything all right? She asked, placing 2 mugs on the counter. You look tired. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you show me any paperwork Jackson has given you recently? Anything related to the house or your bank accounts? Her expression shifted from pleasant concern to bewildered confusion. What's this about, Mia? Please, Mom. Just show me what you have. She disappeared into the small office off the living room, the space my father had used to manage the household finances, and returned with a folder filled with documents I'd never seen before. I spread them across the kitchen table, a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach as I scanned page after page of legal jargon my mother had signed without understanding. Jackson had refinanced the brownstone 18 months ago, taking out a new mortgage that nearly doubled the remaining balance on the original loan. He'd also opened a home equity line of credit for an additional $200,000. The documents were complex, designed to confuse anyone without a background in real estate law. Jackson had presented them to my mother as routine administrative updates that would lower her monthly expenses and streamline her financial management. You said this would make things easier, my mother said quietly, her eyes fixed on my face as I read. You said the payments would go down. I never said that, Mom. Jackson said that, but he signed your name right here. She pointed to a signature line, and I saw my own name, the handwriting a close enough approximation to pass casual inspection, but subtly off in the details. The forgery was skillful, professional, the work of someone who had practiced. When did he have you sign these? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. About 1.5 years ago. He brought them by one afternoon when you were traveling for work. He said you had already reviewed everything and approved it, that he just needed my signature to finalize the paperwork. I trusted him, Mia. He's your husband. Why wouldn't I trust him? I accessed my mother's bank accounts using the information she'd entrusted to me years ago for emergencies. What I discovered made the room tilt. The refinancing had generated over $300,000 in cash, money that should have been deposited into my mother's account. Instead, it had vanished into accounts controlled by Hearthstone Properties, the shell company Vanessa had identified. The monthly mortgage payments had not been made in 4 months. Late fees and penalties had accumulated. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings 2 weeks ago, sending notices to a post office box Jackson controlled. Mom, I said carefully, when was the last time you actually received a bank statement in the mail? She frowned, confusion deepening on her face. Jackson said he had everything switched to electronic statements to save paper. He said he would review them and let me know if there were any problems. Of course, he had. He'd intercepted every piece of communication that might have alerted her to the truth. She'd been living in her home, oblivious to the fact that she was about to lose it. Your house is in foreclosure, I told her, the words heavy on my tongue. The auction is scheduled for Tuesday. The color drained from her face. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her hand gripping the table for support. That's not possible. Jackson said everything was fine. He said the new mortgage made everything easier. Jackson has been stealing from you, Mom. From both of us. And I'm going to stop him, but I need you to trust me now and not contact him about any of this. Can you do that? She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. A renewed wave of rage surged through me. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about shattering an elderly woman's sense of security, about exploiting her grief and vulnerability, about violating the trust she had placed in someone she believed was family. I spent the next 2 hours with my mother, scrutinizing every document Jackson had ever given her, photographing everything with my phone. Then I called Vanessa, providing her with the information she needed to trace the stolen money and document the elaborate fraud. My mother remained mostly silent, occasionally wiping tears, struggling to reconcile the image of the helpful, kind man with the reality of his betrayal. I should have paid more attention, she said finally. I should have asked more questions. This is not your fault, Mom. Jackson is a professional. This is what he does. He targets people who are vulnerable and trusting, and he manipulates them so skillfully that they never see it coming. But even as I spoke those words, the weight of my own guilt pressed down on me. I had introduced Jackson into our lives. I had vouched for him, trusted him, given him access to everything that mattered. If anyone should have seen through his facade, it should have been me. That afternoon, I drove to Martin's office in downtown Manhattan, the corporate attorney who had handled Thornfield's legal matters since my father had first launched the company. I had called ahead, explaining the urgency and the need for absolute privacy, emphasizing that I couldn't risk being seen at Thornfield's offices because I was supposedly in London. Martin's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the East River, a space designed to project competence and success. He ushered me into a private conference room, his expression growing grave as I detailed Vanessa's discoveries about Jackson's true identity and the extent of his fraud. I need to know if the company is vulnerable, I said, spreading the documents across the conference table. If he's been stealing from me personally and from my mother, what's to stop him from targeting Thornfield? Martin examined the forged documents, his face darkening as he recognized the sophistication of the forgeries. These are good, he murmured. Really good. Someone with inside knowledge of how your corporate paperwork is structured created these. He pulled up digital files on his laptop, comparing the forged documents to the genuine ones in Thornfield's records. The similarities were unsettling. Jackson had somehow gained access to corporate templates, authorization forms, and insurance documents that should have been impenetrable. If he presents these to the right people at the right time, Martin explained, he could potentially freeze company assets pending resolution of ownership disputes. He could file a claim against the business in a divorce proceeding. He might even try to position himself as having a stake in the company through these fabricated authorizations. My father's legacy, everything I'd built over 4 years of relentless dedication, all of it teetering on the brink of collapse because I had trusted the wrong person. What do we do? I asked, my voice tight with desperation. We file protective orders immediately. Emergency injunctions preventing any transfer of corporate assets or ownership claims. I'll have them drafted and filed within 2 hours. Leaving Martin's office, I felt a flicker of hope, but the anger still burned. Jackson hadn't just targeted me. He had attacked everything and everyone I held dear. My mother, my company, the legacy my father had entrusted to me. That evening, back in my hotel room, I did something I'd been dreading. I called Jackson, not from my regular phone, but from a burner phone Vanessa had procured, routing the call through a VPN service to make it appear as though I was calling from London. Every detail had to be flawless, every element of the performance perfect. He answered on the second ring, his voice oozing manufactured affection. Hey babe, how was your first day at the conference? I forced a tone of weary enthusiasm, the kind someone would adopt after a long day of presentations and networking. Exhausting, but good. The keynote this morning was fascinating, all about quantum encryption protocols. I took so many notes my hand is cramping. Sounds like you, he said with a laugh that once made me smile. Always the perfectionist. Did you get a chance to eat anything? Or were you too busy impressing everyone? The casual intimacy made my skin crawl, but I maintained my composure. Grabbed a sandwich between sessions. The time difference is hitting me harder than I expected. I think I'm gonna turn in early tonight. Good idea. Get some rest. I miss you. Miss you too, I replied, the lie leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. I'll call you tomorrow after my presentation. After hanging up, I stared at the phone in my hand, marveling at the ease with which I'd deceived him. Was this what Jackson felt every time he spoke to me? This eerie disconnect between the spoken words and the underlying truth? The thought made me queasy, but I shoved it aside. There would be time to process the emotional fallout later. Right now, strategy was paramount. The next morning, Friday, I met Vanessa at a different coffee shop, this one in the financial district, not far from where Sienna lived. Vanessa had spent the past 2 days piecing together the financial puzzle of Jackson's operation, and the picture she presented was staggering in its audacity. $647,000, she said, sliding a folder across the table. That's how much they've taken from you and your mother combined. But there's more in accounts tied to previous victims. I estimate they've stolen close to $2 million over the past decade. $2 million. Multiple lives shattered. And for what? So Jackson and Sienna could revel in luxury apartments and expensive vacations, while their victims struggled to rebuild their lives from the wreckage? I found something else, Vanessa continued, her expression grim. Rachel Montgomery, the doctor in Connecticut. She's not the first. There was a woman before her, Patricia Ellis. She was an investment banker in Boston. Jackson and Sienna took her for nearly $800,000 9 years ago. After they disappeared with her money, Patricia tried to rebuild, but the stress triggered a heart condition she didn't know she had. She died 6 months later. She was 39 years old. The folder contained photographs Vanessa had unearthed from old social media accounts and news articles. Patricia Ellis smiling at a charity gala. Patricia Ellis receiving an award for financial excellence. Patricia Ellis's obituary, listing a heart attack as the cause of death, but omitting the devastating fraud that had preceded it. They killed her, I whispered. Maybe not directly, but they killed her just the same. And Lauren Prescott killed herself after they destroyed her, Vanessa added. Mia, these people are not just thieves. They're predators who leave a trail of broken lives behind them. If we don't stop them now, completely and permanently, they'll simply do this again to someone else. I knew she was right. Shielding myself and my mother was not enough. This had to end in a way that ensured Jackson and Sienna could never prey on another innocent victim. That afternoon, I did something even Vanessa considered risky. I went to Sienna's apartment in the financial district. I'd prepared meticulously, dressing in professional attire that suggested business rather than confrontation, carrying a leather portfolio concealing a hidden recording device. When I knocked on her door, I wore an expression of friendly professionalism, masking the fury simmering beneath the surface. Sienna answered, clad in designer athleisure where that likely cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was even more striking in person, possessing the effortless beauty that comes from expensive treatments and fortunate genetics. Her expression was friendly but cautious, the guarded demeanor of someone who lived a life of deception and had learned to assess potential threats swiftly. Can I help you? She asked, not opening the door fully. I hope so. My name is Jennifer Ross. I'm a freelance journalist writing a feature about young entrepreneurs in the property investment space. Your name came up in my research, and I was hoping you might spare a few minutes to discuss your success with Hearthstone Properties. I saw her expression shift from caution to interest. Greed and vanity, the twin weaknesses that made even seasoned con artists susceptible to being conned themselves. She widened the doorway and gestured for me to enter. Her apartment was exactly as I'd envisioned. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, furniture seemingly lifted from the pages of design magazines, art on the walls that was either incredibly valuable or impeccably reproduced. Every detail screamed wealth, wealth I knew had been acquired through exploitation. Honestly, I'm always happy to talk about my work, Sienna said, settling onto a white leather sofa and inviting me to sit opposite her. What specifically would you like to know? I posed questions about property investment, her business model, the secrets to her rapid success. She responded with practiced ease, weaving a narrative of astute market research, strategic investments, and calculated risks. Every word was a lie, delivered with unwavering confidence. After about 15 minutes of this carefully constructed performance, I steered the conversation in a slightly different direction. I'm particularly interested in how you identify undervalued properties. What's your process for finding opportunities that other investors might overlook? Well, it's really about understanding human psychology, she said, warming to the subject. People make emotional decisions about property, especially when they're in vulnerable situations. If you can identify those situations early, you can position yourself to acquire assets at below market value. Vulnerable situations. She was describing her victims without even realizing it. That's fascinating, I said, leaning forward slightly. Can you give me a specific example? Obviously, nothing confidential, but perhaps a general scenario of how this works in practice. She hesitated for a moment, visibly weighing her options. But the intoxicating blend of flattery and perceived journalistic interest outweighed her caution. Okay, so for instance, there's a property in Cobble Hill we're closing on next week. The owner is an elderly woman who became overwhelmed managing the building after her husband passed away. We helped her refinance to make things easier, and now we're poised to acquire the property at the foreclosure auction for about 60% of its market value. Once we flip it, we're looking at a substantial profit, around $700,000. The sum Sienna Hartley quoted as casually as if discussing the closing price of a stock. My mother's house, reduced to a financial transaction, a line item on Sienna's ledger of deceit. She sat across from me in her pristine, modern apartment, the very picture of affluent indifference, detailing the systematic theft of my mother's home as if it were nothing more than a routine business deal. The recording device, discreetly hidden within my portfolio, documented every callous word. That's impressive, I managed, striving to keep my voice even, betraying none of the fury churning within me. And you work with a partner on these ventures, is that correct? Jackson Brennan. Jackson Roar, she corrected automatically, the slip immediate and telling. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she regained her composure. I mean, yes, Jackson Brennan. We've been working together for years. I retrieved my phone, navigating to a photograph I had prepared. Not of Sienna and Jackson, but of Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott. Two women whose lives had been irrevocably destroyed, extinguished even, by the machinations of Jackson and Sienna. I held the phone out, ensuring she had a clear view of the screen. Do you recognize these women? I asked, my tone measured. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen. Who are you? My name is not Jennifer Ross. It's Mia Thornfield. And that property in Cobble Hill you're planning to steal? That's my mother's house. The one you and Jackson have been systematically robbing blind while he was pretending to be my loving husband. She shot to her feet, backing away toward the door as if I were a venomous snake. These women are dead, I continued, my voice remaining deceptively calm despite the storm raging inside. Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott. Dead because of what you and Jackson did to them. How many others, Sienna? How many lives have you destroyed for your own personal gain? Get out of my apartment, she hissed, her voice rising in pitch. Get out or I'm calling the police. Please do, I said, rising to my feet but making no move toward the door. I'd be delighted to explain to the police exactly what you and Jackson have been up to. I have documentation of everything. Bank records, forged documents, evidence of your previous victims. I've spent the last 5 days building a case that will put both of you away for a very long time. Her hand hovered over her phone, but she hesitated, unable to dial. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, desperately searching for an escape route, only to find every avenue blocked. Or, I continued, pressing my advantage. You could cooperate. Tell me everything. Every detail of your operation, every account where you've hidden money, every victim you've targeted. Do that, and maybe I'll mention your cooperation when I speak to the district attorney. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and I witnessed the precise moment when her survival instinct triumphed over her loyalty to Jackson. "I want a lawyer," she stated, her voice barely a whisper. "And I want immunity." "Then you better have something worth trading," I retorted, the words sharp and unwavering. Sienna sank back onto her white leather sofa, the confident facade she had worn earlier now completely shattered. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and I could practically see her mind racing, performing calculations that were rapidly leading to unfavorable conclusions. She was cornered, and she knew it. "I need to make a call," she said finally, her voice stripped of the smooth confidence it had possessed just minutes before. "Go ahead," I replied, settling back into my chair, my portfolio still silently recording every word. "But understand that the clock is ticking, Sienna. Jackson is planning to execute your scheme tomorrow morning. Once he does that, you're both going down together. But if you cooperate with me now, before he makes his move, you might have something to bargain with." She picked up her phone, but her fingers hovered over the screen, as if it held the answers to questions she was too afraid to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "How long have you known?" 5 days. I came back early from my passport hearing and overheard Jackson on the phone with you, discussing how stupid I was and how easy it had been to fool me. I've spent every moment since then building a case against both of you." She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than cold calculation in her expression. Genuine, undisguised fear. "He said you were in London. That's what he believes. That's what everyone believes, except the people who are helping me build the case against him. Against both of you." "I want a deal," she said abruptly, the words rushed and desperate. "Full immunity in exchange for everything I know. That's not my decision to make. But I can tell you that the district attorney will be a lot more interested in talking to you if you provide information before Jackson executes his plan tomorrow morning than after. Right now, you're co-conspirators, but if you flip on him first, you become a witness instead of just another defendant." She made her call then, to a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize, speaking in hushed tones that I couldn't quite decipher. The conversation lasted several minutes, and when she hung up, some of the fear had been replaced by a harder, more resolute expression. She had made a decision. "My attorney says I shouldn't talk to you without him present, and without a formal agreement from the district attorney's office." "Smart lawyer," I acknowledged, standing and collecting my portfolio. "You should listen to him. But understand something, Sienna. Every hour you wait is an hour that Jackson gets closer to executing his plan. And once he does that, your value as a cooperating witness drops significantly. Think about whether you want to go down with him or save yourself." I walked toward the door, then paused, turning back to face her. "Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott. Those women are dead because of what you and Jackson did. You can't bring them back, but you can make sure there are no more victims after me. That has to mean something even to someone like you." I left her apartment and returned to my car, where Vanessa was waiting in the passenger seat. She had been monitoring the recording remotely through a device connected to my portfolio, and her expression was grim. "She's going to flip," Vanessa said, her voice certain. I could hear it in her voice. "She's more afraid of prison than she is loyal to Jackson." Good. Let her be afraid. Fear makes people tell the truth. Sunday evening arrived, heavy with the weight of everything that was about to unfold. I sat in my hotel room and composed a text message to Jackson, routing it through the VPN to make it appear as though I was sending it from London. The message was simple, innocuous, exactly what he would expect from a wife returning from a business trip. Asterisk flight boarding soon. Should land around 8 a.m. Your time. Can't wait to see you. His response came within seconds. Asterisk can't wait to see you too. I've missed you so much. Safe flight, babe. I stared at those words for a long time, contemplating how easily lies could be masked as affection. How skilled Jackson was at performing emotions he didn't genuinely feel. Then, I switched off the phone and attempted to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would demand every ounce of strength and clarity I could muster. Monday morning dawned under a sky heavy with gray clouds, threatening rain. I woke at 5 a.m., showered, and dressed in the navy suit my father had once complimented. The one he had said made me look like someone who could command respect in any room. The memory of his words steadied me as I drove through the deserted Brooklyn streets towards our brownstone. I parked across the street, choosing a spot where I could observe the front door without being immediately visible. Jackson emerged at 8:30 a.m., precisely on schedule. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit I had bought him for our anniversary 2 years prior, carrying the leather portfolio he reserved for important business meetings. He exuded confidence, purpose, a man who believed himself to be on the cusp of a major triumph. He entered his car and pulled away from the curb, and I followed at a discreet distance. His initial destination was the bank in Cobble Hill that held my mother's mortgage. I knew, thanks to Martin's meticulous preparation, that Jackson intended to finalize the foreclosure paperwork and arrange to purchase the property through one of his shell companies. What he didn't know was that Martin had spent the weekend collaborating with the bank's legal department, presenting irrefutable evidence of fraud and securing their full cooperation in what was about to transpire. I parked half a block away and watched as Jackson confidently strode through the bank's front doors. He was inside for less than 3 minutes before he reappeared. Even from that distance, I could discern a palpable shift in his demeanor. His confident stride had been replaced by something quicker, more agitated. He had his phone to his ear before he even reached the sidewalk, his free hand gesturing wildly as he spoke to someone on the other end. I didn't need to overhear the conversation to understand what had occurred. Martin had been waiting inside with the emergency court order halting the foreclosure, accompanied by bank officials who had been thoroughly briefed on the fraud investigation. Jackson's flawlessly executed plan had just encountered its first significant obstacle, and he was struggling to comprehend how it had happened. He re-entered his car and drove towards Manhattan, and I continued to follow. His next stop would likely be his attorney's office, or perhaps he would attempt to access some of the accounts he had been planning to drain. Regardless, he was about to discover that every carefully constructed avenue he had meticulously planned over the past 18 months had been effectively blocked. However, I wasn't ready to confront him just yet. I wanted him to endure a few more hours attempting to execute his scheme, encountering obstacle after obstacle, witnessing his plan unravel piece by piece before he finally understood who was responsible. Only then would I reveal myself, allowing him to witness the transformation of his perfect victim. Instead, I turned back towards Brooklyn Heights and let myself into our brownstone through the back entrance. I moved through the house silently, gathering a few essential items I would need and securing copies of documents that would serve as critical evidence in the impending criminal case. I could hear Jackson's voice emanating from his office upstairs, his tone growing increasingly frustrated and urgent as he spoke on the phone. "Something's wrong," he was saying, his voice laced with panic. "The foreclosure was blocked. Emergency court order," they said. "And the bank accounts are frozen. Someone filed injunctions. Who could have done this? She's supposed to be in London. She doesn't even know." I ascended the stairs, making no attempt to conceal my footsteps this time. The third step from the bottom creaked loudly under my weight, and I heard Jackson's voice abruptly cut off mid-sentence. When I reached the doorway of his office, he was standing by his desk, his phone still clutched in his hand, staring at me with an expression of utter disbelief. "Mia, what are you doing here? Why aren't you in London?" I stepped into the office, maintaining a safe and strategic distance. "I never went to London, Jackson. I came back early from my passport hearing and overheard you on the phone with Sienna, plotting to steal everything from me and my mother. I've spent the last 5 days building a case against you." His face underwent a series of rapid transformations. Confusion, alarm, calculation, and finally, a forced attempt at the concerned husband expression that had successfully deceived me for 7 long years. "I don't know what you think you heard, but you've clearly misunderstood something. Let me explain." "Stop," I interjected, my voice cutting through his pathetic attempt at manipulation. "I know everything, Jackson. Or should I call you Jackson Rohr? That's your real name, isn't it? The one you used before you went to prison for fraud in Connecticut." He froze completely, every practiced expression crumbling to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. "I know about Sienna," I continued relentlessly. I know about Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott and Rachel Montgomery. I know about the shell companies and the forged documents and the $600,000 you've stolen from me and my mother. And I know that right now, every account you plan to drain is frozen. Every property you plan to steal is protected. And every institution you plan to defraud has been notified about who you really are. Jackson's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain visibly struggling to process the enormity of the situation. The man who had been so confident just hours earlier, who had believed himself to be executing the perfect crime, was now standing in his own office, facing the utter destruction of everything he had built. "You don't understand," he finally managed to stammer, his voice taking on a pleading quality I had never heard before. "It's not what you think. Yes, I made mistakes, but I can explain everything. We can work this out together. Stop talking," I commanded, my voice carrying a coldness that surprised even me. "Every word out of your mouth is another lie, and I'm done listening to lies. The police are on their way. A detective from the district attorney's office will be here within the hour. You can save your explanations for them." He took a step towards me, and I instinctively recoiled, my hand reaching for my phone. The movement stopped him in his tracks, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a realization, perhaps, that the woman standing before him was no longer the person he had married, no longer the trusting victim he had spent 7 years carefully cultivating. "Mia, please just listen to me for 5 minutes. Let me explain how this happened, how things got out of control. I never meant for it to go this far. You never meant to steal $600,000 from me and my mother? You never meant to forge documents and commit fraud? You never meant to target me specifically after my father died because you saw me as vulnerable and wealthy? Which part of your decade-long pattern of destroying women's lives did you not mean to do, Jackson?" His face flushed crimson, anger finally eclipsing the desperate attempt at manipulation. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Think you've won something here? You have no idea what you've done. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Jackson Rohr, convicted fraudster, serial con artist, predator who has destroyed multiple lives and left at least 2 women dead. "I know exactly who you are now. The only question is whether you understand who I am." The approaching wail of sirens pierced the air, causing both of us to turn towards the window. 3 police cars were pulling up in front of our brownstone, their lights flashing ominously in the gray morning light. Jackson's face turned ashen as he watched officers emerge from the vehicles and approach the front door. "This is your fault?" he spat, turning back to me, his voice laced with venom. "You couldn't just let things be. You had to go digging, had to ruin everything. We could have worked this out quietly, but you had to make it into this." "No," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "This is your fault. Every single consequence you're about to face is the direct result of choices you made. You chose to target me. You chose to steal from my mother. You chose to build your entire life on fraud and manipulation. Own it, Jackson. For once in your miserable existence, own what you've done." The doorbell rang, followed by a series of loud, insistent knocks. I walked past Jackson and down the stairs to let the police inside, leaving him standing alone in his office with nowhere left to run. The arrest was swift and efficient. Detective Morrison from the district attorney's office read Jackson his rights while 2 uniformed officers secured the scene and began collecting evidence. I watched from the living room as they led Jackson down the stairs in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking suddenly rumpled and ill-fitting, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. As they walked him past where I was standing, he met my gaze one final time. "I did love you," he said quietly, the words almost lost in the commotion. "At least in the beginning. That was real." "No, it wasn't," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "And we both know it." They took him away, and I stood in the foyer of the brownstone that had once been our home, feeling nothing but a strange emptiness where I thought there should be pain, or triumph, or something more substantial than this hollow sense of closure. The next morning, I sat across from Detective Morrison in a sterile conference room at the district attorney's office in downtown Brooklyn. Spread out between us were meticulously organized folders containing every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past week, arranged with the same meticulous attention to detail I typically applied to cybersecurity assessments at work. "This is remarkable, Miss Thornfield," Detective Morrison said, reviewing the timeline I had constructed, outlining every transaction, every forged document, every point of contact between Jackson and his victims. "In 20 years of working fraud cases, I've never seen a victim present this level of documentation. Most people are so traumatized by discovering the fraud that they can barely function, let alone conduct an investigation." "I was traumatized," I said quietly, "but I was also angry, and I know how to conduct investigations. It's part of what I do professionally. I just applied those same skills to my personal situation." He nodded, making notes on a legal pad. "The recorded conversation with Sienna Hartley is particularly valuable. She admitted to knowing about the scheme, to targeting you specifically, to having done this to previous victims. That's going to be extremely difficult for her attorney to explain away. She called her lawyer immediately after I left her apartment. I assume she's trying to negotiate some kind of deal." "She is," Detective Morrison confirmed. "Her attorney reached out yesterday afternoon. She wants full immunity in exchange for testifying against Jackson, providing documentation of their entire operation, and identifying other victims we might not know about." "Are you going to give her immunity?" He leaned back in his chair, considering the question carefully. "Probably not full immunity, but we might offer a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. The truth is, we need her testimony to make the strongest possible case against Jackson. She can describe their methodology, explain how they researched and targeted victims, provide evidence that establishes this as an ongoing criminal enterprise rather than just individual acts of fraud. That turns this from a few years in prison into potentially decades." "Good," I said simply. "I want him in prison for as long as legally possible. Not because I'm vindictive, but because every year he spends locked up is a year he can't do this to someone else." "There's something else you should know," Detective Morrison continued, pulling another folder from his briefcase. "After news of Jackson's arrest started circulating, we received calls from 3 additional women who believe they were victimized by him and Sienna. 1 in Pennsylvania, 1 in New Jersey, 1 in Massachusetts. The cases go back almost 12 years. We're still investigating, but the pattern is consistent with what you've documented. 12 years. More victims than even Vanessa had been able to identify. How many lives had Jackson irrevocably damaged? How many women had trusted him the way I had, only to discover, far too late, that everything had been a carefully constructed performance? I want to help them, I said, my voice filled with a newfound determination. The other victims. If there's anything I can do to support their cases or help them recover, I want to do it. Detective Morrison offered a small, understanding smile. I thought you might say that. I'll make sure you're connected with the Victim Services Coordinator. In the meantime, we'll be filing formal charges later today. Multiple counts of fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy. Jackson is looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted on all counts. The preliminary hearing was held 3 weeks later in a somber Brooklyn courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and floor polish. I sat in the gallery with my mother beside me, watching as Jackson was led into the room, clad in an orange jumpsuit that made him appear smaller and less significant than the man who had dominated my life for 7 years. His attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit, sat beside him, whispering what I assumed were strategic instructions. The prosecutor laid out the case with cold, clinical precision, detailing the pattern of fraud that had begun more than a decade earlier and had continued through multiple victims across multiple states. She presented evidence of forged documents, fraudulent property transfers, stolen funds that totaled well over $1 million when all victims were accounted for. She played portions of the recording I had made of Sienna, her voice filling the courtroom as she described targeting vulnerable women and systematically stealing everything they owned. Jackson sat motionless through most of it, his face carefully neutral, but I saw his hands clench when the prosecutor mentioned Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott, the 2 women whose lives had ended after he had financially decimated them. When the prosecutor concluded her presentation, Jackson's attorney stood and argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial, that my recording of Sienna had been obtained under false pretenses, and that Jackson had a right to present his own version of events at trial. The judge listened impassively and then set bail at $2 million, an amount Jackson could not possibly meet, given that all of his assets had been frozen. As they led him back out of the courtroom, Jackson's eyes found mine in the gallery. There was no pleading in his expression this time, no attempt at manipulation, just cold, hard hatred that confirmed everything I had come to understand about who he truly was. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. "Your father would be so proud of you, Mia," she whispered. "Not just for stopping Jackson, but for how you did it with intelligence and strategy instead of just emotion." I squeezed her hand in return, feeling tears prick my eyes for the first time since this agonizing ordeal had begun. "I wish Dad was here," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "I wish he could have protected us from this." "He did protect us, Mia," my mother replied softly. "He raised you to be strong and smart and capable of protecting yourself. That's the greatest gift a parent can give." We left the courthouse together that afternoon, my mother and I walking down the stone steps into a gray November light that felt utterly appropriate for the somber occasion. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just a quiet exhaustion that came from carrying the immense weight of betrayal for so long and finally being able to set it down. "What happens now?" my mother asked as we reached the street where I had parked the car. "Now we rebuild," I said simply, my voice filled with a newfound resolve. "Everything he tried to destroy we put back together, better and stronger than before." But I knew, even as I spoke those words, that rebuilding would be far more complicated than the simple statement suggested. Some things, once broken, could never be fully restored to their original form. They could only be transformed into something different, something that carried the visible scars of what had been done to them. The months that followed Jackson's sentencing were filled with practical necessities that left little room for emotional processing. Vanessa worked tirelessly with forensic accountants and law enforcement officials to trace the stolen funds through the intricate maze of shell companies and offshore accounts that Jackson and Sienna had meticulously created. The recovery process was slow and frustrating, complicated by the fact that a significant portion of the money had been spent on Sienna's extravagant lifestyle and could never be reclaimed. Designer clothes and exotic vacations leave no tangible assets to seize, no accounts to freeze, just receipts documenting how other people's life savings had been converted into fleeting, temporary pleasures. In the end, we recovered approximately 62% of what had been stolen from me and my mother. Not everything, but enough to stabilize what Jackson had so callously attempted to destroy. With a portion of the recovered funds, I ensured my mother's brownstone was completely paid off, a weight lifted from her shoulders. Then, working closely with Martin, we established a robust trust, an impenetrable fortress safeguarding the property against any future fraudulent schemes or manipulative attempts. The house, once teetering on the brink of loss, was now secured, granting my mother a sense of genuine peace she hadn't known since my father's passing. Thornfield Security Solutions, however, demanded a different kind of restoration. The company, against all odds, had survived Jackson's attempt at corporate sabotage thanks to the emergency injunctions Martin had skillfully filed. Yet, the very public nature of the case had cast a shadow of doubt among some clients. Questions arose about whether my personal vulnerabilities signaled inherent weaknesses in the security protocols we provided to protect their organizations. For months, I found myself immersed in countless meetings, meticulously explaining to executives and board members how even the most sophisticated security measures could be circumvented by social engineering and manipulation. I emphasized how Jackson's fraud was not rooted in technological vulnerabilities, but rather in the intricacies of human psychology. To my surprise, most clients found my willingness to be transparent about my experience more reassuring than alarming. I channeled my painful experience into a powerful educational tool, developing a presentation about the hard-won lessons I had learned from being targeted by a professional con artist. This transformed my personal ordeal into invaluable content that empowered security officers and executives to recognize similar threats within their own organizations. The presentation became one of our most sought-after offerings, and Thornfield ironically gained clients as a direct result of my public discussions, which delved into the practical realities of manipulation and fraud, moving beyond mere theoretical concepts. However, this professional resurgence was far easier than the arduous path of personal recovery. I found myself struggling to trust in ways that had once come effortlessly. Every new person I encountered was now filtered through a lens of suspicion that I couldn't seem to switch off. Every act of kindness was scrutinized, searching for hidden motives. Every relationship was tested for signs of manipulation or performance. Intellectually, I knew this was not a healthy way to live, that Jackson had inflicted damage on my fundamental ability to connect with others. Yet, knowing something intellectually and being able to change it emotionally proved to be entirely different challenges. Diana, ever perceptive, noticed the shift in me during our weekly planning meetings. 6 months after Jackson's sentencing, she brought me coffee one morning and closed my office door before settling into the chair across from my desk. "You need to talk to someone," she said without preamble. "A therapist? Someone who specializes in trauma." "I'm fine," I said automatically, the default response I had been giving everyone who inquired. "You're not fine, Mia. You're functioning, which is impressive given what you've been through, but functioning is not the same as healing. You've rebuilt the business and saved your mother's house and put Jackson in prison. Now you need to rebuild yourself, and that requires help." He was right, of course. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in complex trauma and betrayal. The sessions were emotionally taxing, forcing me to confront not just what Jackson had done, but how it had changed me, how it had altered my ability to navigate the world with any sense of security or trust. Dr. Warren did not pressure me to forgive Jackson or to release my anger or to blindly embrace vulnerability again. Instead, she helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of psychological violence, and that my weariness and suspicion were protective mechanisms that had served a vital purpose but needed to be calibrated, so they didn't dictate my entire existence. One unexpected outcome of the case becoming public was the network of survivors who reached out to me. These were women who had been targeted by similar fraud schemes, who had lost money, property, or years of their lives to men who had never loved them at all. Some had been victimized by Jackson specifically, while others had fallen prey to different predators who operated with the same calculated cruelty. We began meeting informally, gathering in coffee shops to share our stories and to find solace in the realization that we were not alone in what had been done to us. Rachel Montgomery became particularly important to me during this time. She was Jackson's first known victim, the doctor in Connecticut who had lost her medical practice and nearly $400,000 before uncovering the truth. Rachel had spent years consumed by self-blame, questioning her own judgment and wondering how she could have been naive enough to trust someone so completely. Meeting her and hearing her story helped me understand that what had happened to me was not a reflection of my intelligence, sophistication, or professional competence. It was about encountering someone whose entire skill set was honed for manipulation and deception. Together, Rachel, myself, and several other survivors formed what we called the Fraud Prevention Network. We spoke at conferences about financial crimes and domestic fraud. We wrote articles for business publications, highlighting the warning signs of systematic manipulation. We lobbied for stronger legal protections for fraud victims and better support systems for people attempting to rebuild their lives after having them systematically dismantled. This work gave me a sense of purpose that extended far beyond my own personal recovery. It allowed me to believe that something positive could emerge from the most devastating experience of my life. 2 years after that Wednesday afternoon when I forgot my passport and accidentally uncovered the truth, I stood in my new apartment in Manhattan, gazing at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was undeniably different from the person I had once been. Harder in some ways, more cautious, less willing to extend trust without careful verification, but also stronger, more resilient, and more certain of her own capabilities and judgment. I had sold the Brooklyn brownstones 6 months after Jackson's sentencing. I could not bear to continue living in the space where he had played his greatest role, where every room held memories now tainted by the knowledge that nothing had been genuine. My new apartment was smaller, a 2-bedroom on the Upper West Side with expansive windows that flooded the space with natural light. I had decorated it carefully with furniture I chose myself, artwork that held personal meaning, and books that lined the shelves, serving as constant reminders that knowledge and understanding were worth pursuing, even when they came with pain. I dated occasionally, though never seriously. I went to dinner with men I met through work or was introduced to by friends. I was always cordial and sometimes even enjoyed their company. But I never allowed anyone to get truly close, never let down the walls I had constructed to protect myself from being vulnerable again. Some people told me I was being too careful, that I needed to learn to trust again or I would spend the rest of my life alone. But I disagreed with their assessment. I was not being overly careful. I was being appropriately cautious. I had learned firsthand what human beings were capable of when given access to your trust and resources, and I had no intention of ever forgetting those lessons. My mother worried about me, though she tried to conceal it. She would visit my apartment and comment on how quiet it was, how empty it felt, despite the furniture and artwork. She would subtly inquire if I had met anyone interesting lately, her tone carefully casual, but her concern evident beneath the surface. I would reassure her that I was fine, that I was focused on my work, my advocacy, and the life I was building on my own terms. She would nod and say she understood, but I could see in her eyes that she wondered whether Jackson had stolen not just money, but also my ability to believe in genuine human connection. Perhaps he had, or perhaps I had simply learned a truth about the world that other people were fortunate enough to avoid. Either way, the woman in the mirror was the woman I had become. Not broken despite what others might think, not damaged beyond repair, simply changed in ways that could not be undone, carrying knowledge that could not be forgotten, living with a clarity about human nature that was both a burden and a form of protection. I thought about Jackson sometimes, locked away in a federal prison upstate where he would spend the next decade and a half. I wondered if he truly understood the magnitude of what he had done, if he felt any genuine remorse for the lives he had shattered, or if he simply regretted getting caught. I suspected the latter. People like Jackson did not experience genuine remorse because they did not see other people as fully human. We were merely resources to be exploited, roles to be performed, obstacles to be overcome or avoided. But he had made one critical mistake. He had targeted someone who refused to be destroyed, someone who possessed the resources, intelligence, and sheer stubborn determination to fight back. And in doing so, he had inadvertently created exactly the kind of enemy he should have feared most. The woman in the mirror smiled slightly at that thought, then turned away and went back to living the life she had rebuilt from the ruins of betrayal. If the story of strategic revenge kept you captivated until the very end, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Mia stood in her foyer listening to Jackson's phone conversation, realizing in that single moment that her entire marriage had been an elaborate lie. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more compelling stories like this.